So I think obviously there's a lot happening this week. We have the first black woman nominated to the United States Supreme Court. Hello. That's one promise Biden made good on. Now do the student loans. Remember that one? Remember when you told us you were going to do something about the student loans? We're waiting. So there's that. Very excited. It seems like, generally speaking, there is not much concern that she won't be confirmed. She's had to be confirmed by Senate 3 times before and did so without any major issues. She's had Republicans vote to confirm her in the past, including our own Senator Collins here in Maine and Lindsey Graham from South Carolina. Although he's already kind of taking shots at her. Shocking. But the good news is, even if all the Republicans vote against her, as long as all the Democrats vote for her, she can be confirmed. So, barring any major developments or plot twists or any significant number of Democrats kind of crossing the aisle, she should be confirmed. And that'll also mean we've almost achieved parity gender-wise. We'll have 5 men on the Supreme Court and 4 women, which we love that too. So she should have no problem getting confirmed. Again, barring any foolishness. So that's good. Yeah. But the kind of big stories, I think there are 2 prominent stories, and then there's a third one that's kind of getting overshadowed by the other 2, but it's still, I think, important to keep our eyes on. So, of course, we have this invasion of Ukraine. Vladimir Putin is showing his whole ass, invading Ukraine. Again, let's be clear, this isn't the first time he's done this, but it is certainly the first time he's done this at this scale, this flagrantly, and without really any kind of negotiation or opportunity to prevent it prior. So Putin has, for a very long time, been it's been very clear that he wants Ukraine back under his kind of influence. Ukraine is one of the former Soviet socialist republics, which would be the countries that kind of came to be after the fall of the Soviet Union. There's about 15 of them. And they're pretty much all the small countries that line the western side of Russia. Ukraine is the largest of them. It's also one of the most kind of economically advantageous of them. Ukraine's one of the only countries in Europe that can sustain itself without having to import food. There are a lot of natural resources in Ukraine. 80% of the world's stores of neon gas, which we need to make microchips, are in Ukraine. So there's a lot of economic benefit to having Ukraine under his not direct control. So what I think some people are misunderstanding or thinking is happening is that he's invading Ukraine to make Ukraine part of Russia. That is not likely the case. What's most likely what he's trying to do, and what he's tried to do in other places, including Belarus, which is the neighbor to the north of Ukraine, is install a puppet government. So what he's likely trying to do is make it to Kyiv, which is the capital of Ukraine, either kill or capture the president, Vladimir Zelensky, and then depose him and instead install a government that is Russia-friendly, that will do what he tells them to do. That's what we have in Belarus right now. Russia has been able to attack Ukraine from the north, east, and south, in part because Belarus is allowing Russia to stage troops and move through their territory, even though the dictator there is saying, no, we're not doing that. We're not letting them, we're not assisting them, we're not part of it. So either he's lying to our faces, which is almost 100% the case, or he's not the one running the country anymore. There is a woman there who claims to be the legitimate leader of Belarus, democratically elected. She's in exile right now, so she's attempting to try to move to install a more democratic government in Belarus, but for all intents and purposes, this guy in Belarus is one of these kind of Russian puppet governments that he's likely trying to install in Ukraine as well. Yeah, a lot of folks are posting on TikTok, Instagram, Facebook. There are a lot of folks tweeting from Ukraine right now. And it's hard to watch. I mean, I've said this on Twitter, but I'm by no means am I like an international diplomat or someone who is particularly well studied in international affairs and public relations and things like that. However, I have a hard time, and I think it's also worth noting that the response to seeing this invasion of Ukraine has been very different than similar invasions we see and that are still currently happening in other parts of the world, at times at the hands of the United States. We're sitting here crying and our hearts are breaking for people in Ukraine while we are still bombing Somalia, while Saudi Arabia is still bombing Yemen with bombs and missiles that we gave them, while pretty much all of the Middle East is still actively in conflict, either directly as a result of our intervention or using weapons that we've provided to them. So that said, it can be both. Yes, this is tragic. This is heartbreaking. What's happening in Ukraine, I think we have more, we're seeing more of it than we have in other places. Ukraine is a more developed and technologically advanced place, so there's a lot more connection to Western social media. Things like TikTok are a lot more accessible there. So we're seeing a lot more of it without the filter of the media or other folks trying to maybe put a spin or put a story to it. So we're maybe getting more of a raw glance at it than we have in other places. But this is by no means the only place this is happening. And in a lot of cases, it's happening because of us. So that can be true. And we can also be sad about what's happening in Ukraine. I can't imagine being the president of Ukraine right now, knowing that we have what? Was it 50,000 troops, 100,000 troops that Russia's got staged either in Ukraine or outside the borders? Um, Pretty much with the express sole purpose of getting him out of power, probably by either imprisoning him or killing him. And that the odds are very good, if we're being blunt, that within the next month, 2 months, I mean, Russia has made it almost all the way to Kyiv at this point, so he may either be imprisoned or dead at that point, or in exile and running. But that doesn't seem to be part of his plan. I can't imagine being in his position knowing that nobody is going to come in and physically help. We will send money, we will send troops, we will send aid, but nobody, or not troops, equipment, but nobody is putting troops in Ukraine. And honestly, and this is what really gets me, the only reason we're not doing so is because Ukraine's not part of NATO. If they were part of NATO, we would be obligated through Article 5 of the NATO treaty um, to act, to defend Ukraine as if we were being attacked ourselves. That's why we're building up troops all the way around Ukraine, because Ukraine is surrounded by NATO members. Poland is a NATO member. Hungary is a NATO member. Romania is a NATO member. Germany is where we have a lot of folks staged. And Ukraine has asked, they have applied to be in NATO, and they're just simply waiting for us to accept them. They've applied to be in NATO, they've applied to be part of the European Union, and just had not been accepted prior to this attack. Most likely, the timing of the attack is in part, I'm sure, due to the fact that they have not been accepted. It is widely believed that they were going to be accepted, and they still could be, although that would get complicated in terms of accepting them while they're in active conflict. Would we be obligated to defend them if we accept them after they've been attacked? I'm not sure how that works. And it's frustrating because of all the former Soviet socialist republics, Ukraine has probably done the best or the most work in terms of distancing themselves politically and culturally from Russia. Ukraine, in the 30 years since it was formed, has become progressively more and more democratic, progressively more and more westward looking. It has become less and less politically aligned with Russia, and more politically aligned and diplomatically aligned with Europe and the United States. He's made it very clear. I mean, today he was issuing threats to Sweden and Finland, warning them not to join NATO, and that there would be I don't remember the exact language he used, but he essentially said he would be forced to retaliate, because that would essentially block him off from diplomatically and politically on the West side. The interesting thing is that his goal of trying to avoid a Ukraine, Sweden, Finland as part of NATO is sort of backfiring, because what he's doing is pushing these countries closer to NATO. So NATO just had a summit yesterday. All 30 leaders, the leaders of the 30 countries that are part of NATO, had a virtual summit. President Biden was there. So this summit that occurred yesterday, Sweden and Finland were invited to it, even though they aren't members. They're partners. There's like an affiliated partner status you can have with NATO. Sweden and Finland both hold that status with NATO. So if anything, these threats
Five pumpkin.
He's pushing folks closer to NATO. So his apparent goal and what he's apparently trying to do is not working. It's in fact blowing up in his face, and we're more likely to see closer cooperation between those countries and NATO as a result. Because generally speaking, democracies and democratic nations don't respond well to threats. You know? So that's what we're seeing. Well, here's the thing, Razor, and I think that's a really common sentiment. The idea that, there are a lot of folks who are like, oh, he's crazy. He's lost touch with reality. He's like this. It's this personal vendetta, and some of those things might be true. We don't obviously know much about him as a person. However, I think it's really important not to write this off as Putin being like unhinged. I think if you're looking at it from his perspective, there's a very clear rationale, and there's a very clear intelligent. I don't think we should underestimate Putin as being like just this power hungry madman. He's a very smart person. He has a very, very long career in not just politics, but he was a KGB operative before that. That actually is what motivates a lot of the decisions and a lot of the things he's done in leadership since then. He very much has this deep-seated sense that Russia deserves to be a global superpower, and that he has long wanted to restore the kind of glory of Russia from its peak during the Soviet days. So this is very much a very logical and very rational effort, if you look at it from his perspective. From our perspective, of course, it looks wildly unhinged. It's someone infringing upon the sovereign right to exist of another nation. But if you look at it from his perspective and from his experience, this is something that's been a long time coming. It's something that he has long been very, very interested in doing. The concern is, will he stop? And this is what I have a hard time with watching this. So much of what we're seeing is, we're not saying this, but our actions dictate that we are lining up outside Ukraine in the event that he doesn't stop at Ukraine. So for me, what I struggle with is that it seems like the West, meaning Europe, the United States, are willing to let him have Ukraine. We will not stop what is likely inevitable from happening. Russia will probably take the capital of Ukraine. They will probably depose this president, whether by imprisoning him, capturing him, chasing him out of Ukraine, or killing him. And they will probably install another regime that is much more friendly to them. Which means Ukraine will probably immediately withdraw from their application to NATO. They will probably immediately withdraw their application to the European Union. And they will almost, I would assume, overnight start taking far more Russia-leaning stances politically and diplomatically. So a lot of the progress that we've seen since Ukraine became a country, since Ukraine first started down this road of moving toward a more fair and democratic nation, could possibly be wiped out overnight. A lot remains to be seen. All signs so far point to the Ukrainian army and the civil defense that's been put up there being much more of a problem for Russia than they had anticipated. That said, Russia's only sent about a third of their soldiers in, so that 2/3 of their forces that they've dedicated to this haven't even entered Ukraine yet. So that's not to say that I think Ukraine can win, per se, and I don't think there are a lot of folks who are of the mindset that Ukraine is going to fend off Russia forever. But we've also seen some signs that there are cracks in Putin's support in Russia. There have always been folks who don't support him, but he has long been very successful in keeping them from speaking out. protest is not seen as a right. It is certainly not a practice that is tolerated. But we've seen generally a lot of younger folks who I think are less insulated from outside media and influence, taking to the streets and expressing that they do not support this war, that they do not want Russia invading Ukraine. So it is possible that the pressure from within Russia could be enough. But that's, again, not going to be something that happens overnight. That's not something that's going to happen even in the short term. Same with all these sanctions that have been levied. There have been a lot of financial sanctions levied against Russia. And today we saw finally some sanctions directed at Putin himself, although most of those are largely, I think, performative. We keep touting that we haven't restricted Putin's visa access. However, he's not allowed to travel to the United States. Who thinks he was planning on coming to the United States? Please tell me. Who was it who was like, you know what, we should make sure he can't come to the United States? Girl, he's invading his neighbor. He's busy. He's not going to come here. No one was worried about him coming here. Meanwhile, Russia's still part of SWIFT, although it does look like maybe Europe is starting to move closer to approving removal of them from SWIFT. SWIFT is an international financial system. It's based in Belgium, in Brussels. It's managed by the Bank of Belgium. And it's essentially, it's a system that if you send money internationally, you probably use SWIFT or you know of SWIFT. So by removing Russia from that system, it isolates the Russian financial system, which is important because so much of what Russia does and so much of their military is funded by oil and natural gas. Russia provides a lot of oil and natural gas to Europe. That's why they're so hesitant to remove them in the first place. Most of Western Europe depends, not entirely, but mostly, up to 40 to 50% of their oil and natural gas comes from Russia. So they're hesitant to cut that off because, of course, that's going to lead to higher gas prices, higher energy prices, higher heating prices for everybody, not just Europe. That will happen here too. People are warning that our gas prices are going to go up. In some places, we might see $5, $6, even $7 a gallon. In some places, like California, where gas prices tend to run higher anyway. But none of these things that we're doing will stop him from continuing. The sanctions aren't going to stop him. Protests are not going to stop him, at least at first. And all indications point to nothing will stop him. With the number of resources and people he's committed to this, it's pretty clear he's not going to stop until he's got the capital. So it really just comes down to how long will he stay there? How long will the people of Ukraine be able to fight back? Who knows what it looks like if and when he withdraws. A lot of the self-imposed isolationist policies have harmed the working class as well. So let's be clear. A lot of what's already been happening in Russia, a lot of what Putin has done in Russia, hurts the working class as well. So I'm not saying that I think that we should be sending troops in, although I have a hard time. I have a hard time with this stance we seem to be taking of we'll just wait here at the borders to make sure he doesn't come further than Ukraine. And then the way the president keeps talking about it really bothers me. About how resilient Ukrainians are and how strong the leadership has been. And this is a proud country full of patriots who will not let their democracy go down unchallenged. Well, we do nothing, but I don't know that we're doing enough. These sanctions all should have been put in place before any invasion happened. When we saw that he was massing troops, when we saw that he was making these threats, that's when these sanctions should have been put in place. So that by time he actually was making an effort to attack, it had a chance to have the effect it was supposed to have to deter him financially, economically, politically, rather than waiting until he's marching across the border to implement these sanctions. And as though we didn't know he was going to do this, or as though we thought that there would be some sort of compromise struck. Because now what we're seeing, and we're already starting to see the early signs of it with China, we already see China making not overt moves, but we're seeing that they are watching this very closely, and I would imagine there will be repercussions in terms of Taiwan. And then I want to be clear that I'm not saying that. What I'm saying is that I don't think Putin has the kind of support that we believe he does, or that he would have us believe that he does. That's all. But I think this has repercussions for China. I think this has repercussions for North Korea. I think this has repercussions for Iran. I think China is watching this very closely, although they are publicly stating that they want Russia to come back to the negotiation table and not continue this attack on Ukraine. I think they are watching to see how we will react, because I think that would inform how they expect us to react should they choose to take action against Taiwan. I think North Korea is looking for the cover that a long-term conflict in Ukraine could provide them in terms of the missile tests they've been doing. We know that they want to push the boundaries that we have set against them. If we're too busy with what's happening in Ukraine, or if something were to happen in Taiwan, that would open the door for them to perhaps do more than they have been. We know Iran has, for decades now, been potential concern, and we know that they have aspirations that would be easier to achieve if we were distracted. So it's hard, because I think on one hand, there are a lot of people watching for our response to this and watching to see how strong our response or how involved we'd be willing to get. And I don't want us to get involved everywhere. You know, we're not trying to be the peacekeepers of the world, but also, where's the line when we see innocent people, when we see you know, in at least in this case, Ukraine hasn't done anything to Russia. This is if you look at the messaging coming out of Russia and the rationale Putin is using to justify what he's doing, that's the part that sounds unhinged. He claims that Ukraine is being run by a cabal of neo-Nazis being propped up by the West, which is bizarre given that the president of Ukraine is Jewish. He's got a really interesting story too, by the way. I didn't really know a whole lot about Ukraine before this, but he, similar to many other world leaders, doesn't have a background in politics. He was an actor and a comedian. He was a TV host on a very popular TV show in Ukraine. He was in a movie where he played the president of Ukraine and then became the president of Ukraine. He's also wildly popular there. They love him there, which is interesting. So there's just a lot at play. And I know that there's a lot happening right now. We're going to talk about some other stuff too. But I think it's really important that we keep an eye on Ukraine. I think it's just really important we talk about this stuff. I by no means claim to be like an expert on international affairs and politics and global workings, but I'm really good at Googling and I watch a lot of the news. So if I can help like demystify or help maybe provide some context to some of this stuff, I'm happy to do so. Like I said, I think it's important that we're all paying attention, even though it's exhausting and scary, and for some of us, you know, it can be really, really triggering. We're seeing a lot of folks who are working on getting out of Ukraine who survived the Holocaust, who have families that survived the Holocaust. There are folks who escaped Afghanistan when the Taliban came back to power in Afghanistan, who fled Afghanistan and ended up in Ukraine, who are now also forced to flee again from the Russians. So it's incredibly complex. That's why there are so many people who devote their lives to covering this stuff, who spend their professional lives working in this space. And I am not one of those people. So I'm by no means trying to like, please don't let me be the only person you're hearing this stuff from. But I also think for us, like regular folks who don't get to, or don't have to, depending on how you look at it, be part of these conversations. I think it can help to have conversations about it in a way that doesn't feel so inaccessible. We can talk about this stuff in regular people language, and not necessarily in the language of the industry. So it's a lot. Like I said, it's scary. It's hard to see the video and the images, the TikToks coming out of Ukraine. It's sad to hear some of the early stories of folks standing up to Russia. Snake Island is, I think, probably the best example thus far. It's a small island off the southern coast of Ukraine in the Black Sea. There was a small kind of border guard outpost on this island with 13 Ukrainian soldiers staffing it. Andy, thank you for contributing to the boost. A Russian warship rolled up to this island and demanded that they surrender. The soldiers essentially said, "Go fuck yourself." Not essentially, that's what they said. They said, "Russian warship, go fuck yourself," and they all were killed. I want to point that out too. That we have a channel in our Discord for resources around these types of conversations, and literally nobody posts there except for Snark and I. So please make sure you're looking at those sources, and also if you're finding resources, please make sure you're posting in there too. We're not going to get quiet. And let's be clear, again, let me remind us, it hasn't been quiet. So prior to what's happening in Ukraine, there have still been often United States and other Western country-led efforts in many countries. We're still bombing Somalia. So it hasn't been quiet. We just haven't been hearing about it. And I think that's an important distinction to make. That just because we haven't had headlines splattered all across our TVs or our newspapers or social media about it, we're still very much actively involved in a lot of places around the world that we really don't have any right to be, or that are only in upheaval because of our involvement. Like I said, I'm sure most of you have probably heard that something is happening in Ukraine, and I don't want to spend our whole stream talking about Ukraine, although we could. But I would just recommend, yes, keep an eye on what is happening there. I get a lot of my information on Twitter because it's one of the platforms that's least kind of gate kept. But that said, still make sure that you're vetting those resources and those sources of information. It's really easy to post fake shit on Twitter as well. So check that it's been corroborated. Check what other people are saying about it before you take any of it at face value. But please make sure to keep plugged into what's happening there because it's not going away anytime soon. I think regardless of whether or not they make it to, they're in Kyiv now, so it's not like they're still working their way there. Russian troops are in the capital now. But whether or not they achieve their objective of decapitating the government of Ukraine soon or not, it's not going away anytime soon. Even if he turns around right now and backs out, there's still a lot of work there to be done. There's still a lot of damage that's been done. There's still a lot of conversations to be had about the future. What, if any, punishment or response is warranted for what Russia has decided to do beyond these sanctions and things that have been rolled out against Putin and Russia as a whole. There's still a lot to come there. The two other kind of big stories from this week, at least on my radar, are similar, but very different. So we have Texas and Florida. So I think maybe the least complex one is Florida. It's relatively straightforward. There's a bill that's been introduced. It's been passed by the Florida House of Representatives. It's now heading to the Florida State Senate, where it's expected to pass, and the governor has already said that he would sign it. It's HB 1557, I believe, is the number. And it has some very misleading name about parental rights, but what most folks know it as is the Don't Say Gay Bill, which would prevent, and there's a lot of conversation around the application of this bill because the language used in the bill is pretty vague. So if you haven't had a chance to look at the bill itself, it's relatively short, it's only a few pages, but the language is very vague. There's a lot of room left for interpretation. But essentially, what it does is it prevents schools and school teachers from having conversations or answering questions about gender identity and sexual orientation or sexuality, um, labeling it and or kind of guard railing it under this guise of age appropriateness. But there aren't any guidelines provided in terms of what would be considered age appropriate conversation around gender or sexuality. Um, Presumably, things like the talk you get typically in health class about puberty and things like that would still be considered age appropriate. Does that conversation not get to be nuanced with the kind of complexity of gender and sexuality, or would that not be considered age appropriate? So there's a lot of wiggle room left for interpretation in terms of what qualifies as age appropriate and what qualifies as conversations around gender and sexuality in this bill. Again, the bill has already passed the House of Representatives. That was the best chance to stop it. There was the most realistic opportunity to defeat it in the House of Representatives. The Senate is much more right-leaning, to be honest. It's a pretty clear party line vote as well. There were, I think, 4 or 5 state representatives who are Republicans who voted against it, but generally it's mostly a party line vote. Yeah, it's probably going to become law. There's little to no opportunity for this bill not to get signed. I think right now our best chance or the best opportunity to prevent it from causing more harm than it already has, because even having these conversations, even having to defend the rights and lives of LGBTQ plus folks is damaging and it already has harmed folks. But I think the best opportunity to stop it is going to be in the courts. I imagine there will be a political or a legal challenge to the bill, and it's going to be a matter of whether or not the courts will uphold it, which in Florida, not going to get my hopes up. But it's also why this conversation about the national U.S. Supreme Court is very important as well, because these types of issues very well could and often do end up making their way up through the court system to the Supreme Court. Yeah, there was an addition that had been proposed, and then it was withdrawn, so it did not make it into the final version of the bill. But there was an addendum at one point that would require anyone with like a mandated reporting requirement, which would be teachers, medical staff, etc. Anyone who would hypothetically be responsible for reporting things like child abuse would have to report to families if a child came out to them, which is, of course, incredibly dangerous and wildly damaging. So that, again, did not make it into the final bill, but it was proposed at one point before it was withdrawn. So I think it's a great reminder that while we often think about, here in the States at least, we often think about rights as being static, in the sense that once we've earned a right or once we've been granted protection or civil rights in some regard, that they can't be taken back. We're learning that that is very much not the case. We're also seeing that when we're talking about abortion access. Roe v. Wade is still the law of the land, but we're also seeing the way it gets interpreted changed. We're seeing bits and pieces of it rolled back in other ways, and states are taking advantage of some of the loopholes or flexibility that's been given to the interpretation of that law, so that it might still be the law, but the practice is very much different. We're now seeing that with particularly with trans folks as well, and it's a great segue to talk about Texas, where and I think it's important, before we get into what's happening in Texas, I think it's important to note what the governor did is not legally binding. So what was done, what was issued, was a letter from the governor of Texas, Greg Abbott, and the attorney general of Texas, directing the state department for, I can't remember what it's called, DF, Family in Texas, Family Department. Family and Protective Service, Department of Family and Protective Services, um, basically telling them that they have to. So what happened? What actually happened? Let's talk about what actually happened, and let's talk about the impact, because I think those are maybe two different things. The governor of Texas sent a letter to the Department for Family and Protective Service, whatever I just said it was. I already closed the tab, saying that because the state had established that providing gender affirming care to trans youth constituted child abuse, that it was the responsibility of that department to investigate those instances as such. So basically, he was saying if someone, and he gave a list that includes a lot of things that young trans people don't often or ever actually do. So, for example, he specifically mentioned removing otherwise healthy body parts. Generally speaking, trans kids don't have access to that kind of care. That's not something that you can do until you're an adult who can consent to those types of procedures. However, one thing he does include that is a very common step taken by trans youth is puberty blockers. So what often will happen with trans youth is rather than making choices about their body that might be harder to reverse or more invasive medically, often trans youth will opt to begin taking puberty blockers, which prevents them from undergoing any kind of dramatic bodily changes until they're old enough to make the decisions themselves as to hormones, medical intervention, surgeries, things like that. So those puberty blockers are a way of kind of allowing for that person to make the decision later on and have the greatest amount of flexibility possible to achieving the kind of body or presentation that they want. It keeps them from going, I was assigned male at birth. If I had started puberty blockers before I hit puberty, it would stop me from undergoing what we know as male puberty. So that if I, at 18 or 19 or 20 or however old, as an adult decided that I wanted to transition and present in a more feminine manner, my body would be closer to that, and I would be able to achieve perhaps a more feminine or closer to whatever my ideal of femininity might look like because I was on those puberty blockers. It's considered a life-saving step for trans youth because for a lot of them, that's the only option that's available to them because other steps are limited to adults. It also creates a climate in Texas where, and we've seen them do this with abortion access too in a lot of states, where it creates this kind of watchdog culture where if I'm a teacher or if I'm a medical health provider, if I'm anyone who works with kids, I'm now mandated and obligated to report trans youth as examples of child abuse. The letter specifically lists if they're undergoing any of these steps. But I, as someone who works with kids, might not know any of those things. I might only know that this child is trans. And I may not wait to hear about whether or not they're going through any of those processes or undergoing any of those treatments before I report them to the state under this Child Abuse Act. So it's creating this culture in which people are being encouraged, and when we're talking about the abortion bill, incentivized even to turn in trans folks to the state. And while providing gender affirming care is not child abuse, subjecting them to an investigation from the state Child, Family, and Protective Services is. Taking children away from parents who have sought to get them the affirming care that they need is child abuse. And we also know that these same systems that we're being encouraged to report trans youth to also exploit and target and impact unequally and disproportionately Black and brown folks as well, and poor folks in general. So these are already systems that don't work in a fair manner, and we're being told specifically to feed even more vulnerable folks, some of our most vulnerable, into that system under this guise of protecting them from the child abuse of affirming their gender. It is terrible, absolutely. And again, I want to be clear, this is not a law. This is not a court ruling. This is just a letter from the governor of the state and the attorney general dictating to this organization what they should or shouldn't do. We're already seeing that a lot of counties in Texas, most of the counties containing the larger cities in Texas, have already said they will not follow this directive. that does not mean it's okay. This does not mean that we're safe, because there will be plenty of districts that will follow the directive. There will be plenty of districts that will not come out forcefully enough against it and make sure that people know not to report trans kids under this directive. It's already damaging even by the sheer fact that the governor has said it, because there will be people who, regardless of whether or not they know that this is a legal precedent or whether or not this is a legal statute in Texas, they will understand it as such. And we're seeing it. People are putting together GoFundMe's so they can move their kids out of Texas because they don't feel like it's safe there. We see, and we know this to be true, that whenever an attack is launched on trans folks, we see an uptick in things like substance abuse, mental health outcomes plummet when they're already dangerously low in so many cases, and we see an uptick in things like suicide. So this is already damaging, even though it's not, because I'm seeing a lot of already media outlets in particular saying, oh, well, let's roll this back. It's not a law. This is just a letter from the governor. I don't care. Sure, it's great that it's not actually legally binding, but that doesn't have to be the case in order for it to be damaging. And that's exactly the problem. The fact that there is a governor, this is the person who runs an entire, he's responsible for the safety and well-being of the people in his state, is saying that by being trans and having a trans child that you support, that you are harming them. I have always said I want to be having more of these conversations, and I think, we talked about Ukraine, we talked about Florida as well. I think we have an obligation to talk about these things. I think for a lot of folks, it's easy to hide behind this, like, I don't understand it enough, so I can't engage. We're past the point where you can do that. The phrase I keep thinking of, and I can't remember where I saw this first, it's not something I came up with, but I keep hearing, there is no neutral. And that's the case with any social justice topic, but I think we're seeing it increasingly when we're looking at these attacks on trans kids in particular, when we see bathroom bills, when we see attacks on trans kids in sports, trans girls and women in sports particularly. No one seems to be worried about trans men in sports. We can't just sit here and clutch our pearls. We have to do more. And this is me trying to help us do more. A lot of folks are talking about, oh, we'll just move where it's safer for you. Not everybody has that option. Not everybody wants to. I should be able to live in a state without worrying about whether or not my rights will be taken away there or my life will be threatened there. It's also really important to know, I think a lot of folks are saying, oh, we'll just get out of Texas, and here are some of the states that are closest that have the best protections for trans youth. The reality is, a lot of the states with great protections for trans youth, it's wildly expensive to live. You know where a lot of folks are looking at moving? Colorado and California, two of the most expensive states in the country to live in. It's not feasible to leave for a lot of folks, and they shouldn't have to. I get wanting folks to prioritize their immediate safety, and if that's what they choose to do, and if that's something they can do, great. More power to you. And the reality is, there are a lot of folks for whom that's not an option, or not a realistic option. Can't help but question how much of this is plain ignorance and how much is fear-based blocking veiled with religious beliefs. Well, from what I'm seeing, and again, I am by no means the expert on any of the things we've talked about today. I'm just someone who has done some reading. There doesn't seem to be any religious veiling here. The letter that was sent out made no reference to religion being the basis for it. That doesn't mean that it isn't, and that it doesn't drive a lot of the decisions that folks make in those positions. I would say when we're talking about legal attacks on trans folks, it's very rarely ignorance. I think one of the ways that we've allowed it to get to this point is by thinking it was ignorance. I think for a long time, a lot of us took the stance that they just don't know any better and we just need to educate them. When we were looking at marriage equality, and that was the fight, the way we got that was sitting down with folks, friends, neighbors, family, and having conversations about what marriage equality actually looks like. And I think we think that can apply here too. The reality is, the people who are attacking trans youth in America right now know that that's what they're doing. It's not an ignorance of the truth. There are plenty of organizations and individuals out there. Almost every major medical association in the United States has come out in support of providing gender-affirming medical care to trans youth as soon as possible, and that the earlier they're able to get that care, the better their lives are, the happier they are, the healthier they are. This is a case of politicians ignoring that advice, ignoring the people who are the experts on trans healthcare, who are the experts on trans well-being and trans rights, and launching these attacks anyway, knowing probably that there is a religious component there, knowing that their constituencies are largely opposed on religious basis, but knowing that they probably can't make that case on a legal basis. You can't legally say, my religion tells me that supporting trans kids is child abuse, and therefore I have to dictate that this department can no longer support that. But what I can say is, this is child abuse, and on a moral standpoint, I'm going to issue this dictate. But the reality is, politicians, governors, they know the truth. They've heard from these folks. They hear from folks every day, nonprofits, doctors, medical professionals, trans human beings who have told them. So yeah, I would hesitate to write it off as ignorance, at least at the governmental level. Individual basis, sure. I think there are a lot of individuals and people that we might know who just don't know enough, but they're not making decisions that impact thousands of trans youth in Texas. The people who are making those decisions, they know. I think it's important not to just take any media source at face value. And that's why, and I know that there are pros and cons to seeing and getting your news from social media in particular. However, that's also one of the best and easiest ways to get information straight from the people who are impacted. So there are tons of organizations on the ground in Texas who are doing this work. I'm actually going to go ahead. This is not a finished resource. I created this I'm leading a conversation at my job on Tuesday about this because we have a lot of trans folks who want our company to be doing more. But it's a card I created with some resources. So for folks who are looking to educate themselves, for folks who are looking for the actual text of the bill in Florida or the letter from the governor of Texas, both of those are linked there as well. We can go ahead and go through it together, actually. So it's a really simple website here. I didn't create any of the resources listed on here. This is just kind of a collection of sources that I've found elsewhere. So by no means do I take credit for any of this, and I'm not the one who maintains any of these resources other than this actual kind of clearinghouse for them. However, the first two buttons here is Governor Abbott's letter, so you can click on that and get the full text of the letter he sent. And it tells you who he sent it to, so you know who to reach out to if you want to provide input. Similarly, here's the bill in Florida. Again, it's only 4 pages. It's not super, super long, so I would encourage you to give that a read through if you're not familiar with what's happening there. There's some opportunities to take action here. So if you're looking to actually do something beyond just giving money or signal boosting, there's some really great options here. I plan on doing this first one. Equality Florida is one of the organizations in Florida leading the fight against this Don't Say Gay bill. They're not giving up, even though it passed the House of Representatives. They're doing some phone banking where it's like 3 hours a day, every day pretty much until the next time that they expect the Senate to vote on this bill. And it's from like 3 to 6 p.m. Eastern time. So if it's a time that you're able to do, it's all web-based. So you're not using your own phone. You're using a web platform to call members of Equality Florida. So you're calling people who are likely sympathetic to your cause. It's not cold calling. You're not calling random people. You're not likely to call people who are going to fight with you and argue trans rights with you. These are generally people who have signed up to be part of Equality Florida, but might not be engaged in this particular conversation, just to let them know about what's going on and encourage them to reach out to their state senators to vote no and reject this bill. So if that's something you're interested in or able to do, please click on that button and you can sign up right through them and they'll give you all the tools that you need to do it. The second button is a great way to find anti-trans legislation in your own state. I think it's really easy for us to frame this as a Southern issue or as a Texas, Florida, Arizona, the states that typically, Alabama, Mississippi, the states that we tend to kind of frame as the leaders when it comes to this type of legislation. However, almost every single state in the country has had some sort of anti-trans legislation. I live here in Maine. We're a relatively blue state. We've had, I think, 4 different anti-trans bills proposed in our state legislature within the last year or two. So that tool is it's a really great one, and I recommend checking it pretty regularly. It allows you to pick your state, so you can filter it by state. So say I want to look at North Carolina, for example. I know we have some folks in North Carolina here. I can change it and it shows me all of the bills. It shows me the status. So NC H358 is still an active bill. It's in the House committee right now, and this would require schools to classify all other sports as being for males, men or boys, females, women or girls, or co-ed or mixed. So this is a trans youth in sports bill. It's meant to ban athletes who are trans from participating in sports with the gender with which they identify, as opposed to the gender they were assigned at birth. So that's still an active bill in North Carolina. So you can reach out to your representatives in North Carolina in the House and ask them to fight this bill on your behalf. It gives you the names of the representatives to contact. So in this case, I would assume this is these folks are the people on the committee that's currently considering the bill. I don't know that for sure, but that would be my guess, is that this is the committee that's currently considering that bill. And there's also a second bill here, it looks like, prohibiting trans care for minors. So prohibiting trans youth from accessing medical care. It looks like that failed in the Senate committee. So similarly, you can filter that by any of the states in the United States. Again, I see here Maine, looks like we had 4 bills. They've all failed, so there are no active bills here in Maine, but that doesn't mean that there couldn't be more. It's possible for them to show up at any time. And there's usually a link here that you can use to view like the full text of the bill. There are a couple links here from the ACLU on how to write your elected officials. So it gives some kind of templates and language that you can use when writing letters or emails to your elected officials, if that's something that you haven't done before or you haven't been able to do before. There are some templates specifically here for contacting the officials in Texas and the Department of Family and Protective Services. These are not exclusively for people in Texas. So be aware that if you do not live in Texas, you can still reach out. You can still send letters to the governor, to members of Congress, to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services. They are less likely to listen to you on the basis of you being a constituent. So I think general guidance on that is, say, if I write a letter from Maine, which I plan to do, my argument isn't going to be you should listen to me because I live in Texas and I voted for you, or I will not vote for you. It's appealing to their humanity. So things like, I am parent of a trans person, or I have trans friends, or I am someone who just cares about equality and I want my trans neighbors to have the same access and ability to have the kind of healthcare that affirms them and that they need. This is a need, not an elective option for them. That might be kind of the approach you might take. Yes, Kath, I will post this in the Discord. Becoming an advocate. This is a program through one of the nonprofits in Texas. Basically, this puts you on a list of folks who are interested in helping out should this particular organization mobilize in any specific way. So this is kind of just an interest form if you are willing to phone bank for them, if you are willing to text bank for them. I've done some text banking in the past as well. It's actually kind of fun. Just kind of volunteering yourself as someone who's willing to contribute beyond just signal boosting and donating. I think a lot of us stop there. We'll throw some money at an organization, we'll retweet a few tweets, and then we feel like we've done enough. It's never enough. We can always do more, and we always should be doing more. For those who have the ability, and I would say, even if it's just a few dollars, that means a lot. So don't think that just because you can't donate hundreds of dollars or thousands of dollars that your money can't make a difference. There are some options here. There's a link here to donate to Equality Florida. Again, they're the organization kind of leading the fight against the Don't Say Gay bill. They do have some incentives. I think right now it's a Tumblr if you're interested in becoming a member of Equality Florida. That is a recurring donation. I think it's $10 a month. If you're able to do so, please do. There's also a spreadsheet here. This is someone on Twitter has kind of pulled this all together. There is an email address up here at the top. If you have additional resources that you'd like to have added to the list, you can reach out to that email to get them added. But these are all organizations in Texas that are working actively, not just to fight this directive from Governor Abbott, but also just every day are working to support trans folks. Some of them are very specifically for Black and brown trans folks, and some of them are very specifically for Black trans women. We know, of course, intersectionality means that a lot of folks are neglected from movements even when they're part of the community. So when we talk about the trans community, there is no monolith there. There are levels of privilege within that community as well. So there are organizations that work specifically to support some of the most marginalized within the trans community as well. And a lot of these are organizations, when we see these kind of big national events that get a lot of attention. We're seeing a lot of streamers. Equality Texas is on here. They just were added to Tiltify, and I love that there are so many streamers that are immediately jumping to raise money for Equality Texas through Tiltify. I'm so grateful for that. And Equality Texas is going to have so much cash on their hands in the next few months because they are going to be one of the organizations most people are donating to, which is great. And I don't want to tell people that they shouldn't be donating to them. And there are other organizations that work directly with trans people who need the money that aren't going to be getting the kind of attention that Equality Texas is. So I would encourage you, especially if you don't have hundreds and hundreds of dollars and you feel like your donation isn't going to go very far, if you throw your $10 at a group like the Thrive Youth Shelter, or Thrive Youth Center, I'm sorry. It's a shelter in San Antonio for LGBTQ plus youth. It's a place for homeless queer youth to go. That money is going to make a difference for them. And they are an organization that is not going to be seeing the same kind of influx of donations that an Equality Texas is going to get, or the Human Rights Campaign is going to get, or the ACLU is going to get, or Lambda Legal is going to get. These are organizations that do much of the same kind of work, but often in a much more boots on the ground, face-to-face kind of way. Some of these organizations literally turn around and just give your money to trans people. It's not about providing food. It's not about providing programming or resources or advocacy. It's literally about just giving money to trans people to do with as they see fit. These are organizations that need our support too. So yes, donate to the Equality Texases of the world. Donate to ACLU. Maybe don't donate to the Human Rights Campaign. I have a lot of thoughts about them, and that might be a topic for another day. But there are tons of organizations doing this work, and there's no shortage of opportunity for your money to go far. And then lastly, there's a link here with just some resources for folks. If you've got trans friends, family members, if you have kids in your life who are trans, who are seeing this and feeling pain, if they're feeling the harm, if they're feeling unseen or unheard in the world right now, that's 100% justified. There is an attack on trans youth in the United States. It's happening at the state level, but it's also happening around the country, whether or not you have a red state or a blue state or a purple state. I see the term now more than ever, a trans genocide. There is an active effort to eradicate trans folks, whether that be by forcing them to live as the gender they were assigned at birth. We know that it's already hard to survive as a trans person. The life expectancy for trans folks is shamefully low. The suicide rate in trans youth is at or over 50%. Attempted suicide rate. Imagine that. What other community would we allow that to happen? What other community would we allow half of them to have attempted suicide and we would just ignore them or keep attacking them? Lobby bills like this at them. None of them. This is a conscious effort which requires a conscious response. But if you've got queer or trans youth in particular, some of these resources are not just for youth. Some of them are. The Trevor Project is specifically for queer youth. There are just some lists here. Trans Lifeline, a lot of us might be familiar with them. They operate a trans-led and trans-operated lifeline hotline for trans folks in crisis, or also just trans folks who need someone to talk to. So you do not have to be in crisis to call the Trans Lifeline, but it exists as a resource for folks who are in crisis. Equality Florida, similarly, offer a lot of resources. Trevor Project is another hotline geared specifically towards queer and trans youth. I think they serve up to age 23, 25. That said, if you call in and you don't fit within like the age range, they will support you or get you in touch with someone who can. They operate a phone line, they operate a chat line on their website, and they also offer text support. One thing I want to point out, and this for those of us who maybe don't understand the severity or the lengths to which queer youth have to go to protect themselves, I want to point out this one feature that I found out about accidentally here on the Trevor Project website. Because so many youth are not out at home, or for whom it's not safe to be out at home, the Trevor Project implemented this specific feature on their website for when, say I am a trans youth and someone walks in and I don't want them to see that I'm on the Trevor Project website. If I'm on this website and I hit my escape key 3 times, it closes the Trevor Project website. It opens up a new Google tab. And if I go to my search history right now, my Google history, the Trevor Project website has been removed from it. We exist in 2022 in a world where features like this are necessary to keep kids safe. And if that doesn't drive my point home, I don't know what possibly can. I can't imagine having to think of things like this when developing resources for people. Simply just for, and remind you, the Trevor Project exists primarily as a crisis response tool. So this is for students, for young people, for kids who are in crisis, who are experiencing suicidal ideation, who are experiencing bullying, who are experiencing verbal or physical violence. And they need tools like this to keep their parents from finding out, or folks who might harm them from finding out. So when I tell you that you can make a difference, and when I tell you that your $5, $10, your 3 hours on a Friday afternoon can make a difference, this is what I mean. Far too many of us just sit by and clutch our pearls, wring our hands, and pray for a better world. But the reality is that we have to make it a better world, and this is how we do it. This is by no means an exhaustive list. And please let me know if you find other resources that might make this a more well-rounded resource for folks. But there are things we can do. There's no more room for us to say that I don't know what to do, or that we can't make a difference, because we have to try. And that means making ourselves uncomfortable. That means making ourselves vulnerable. That means putting ourselves at risk or in danger if necessary. Because this is quite literally a matter of life and death for people. And there's just no more room. Again, there is no neutral. There is no space for us to just sit by and hope that it gets better. We have to make it get better. And that's scary, and that's hard to hear, but it's the truth. And it's what trans kids in this country and around the world need from us. And if we can't at least meet that occasion, then what are we doing? So again, this is a resource. It's by no means an exhaustive one. I'll drop it here in the chat one more time. And I'll post it in the Discord for folks. But yeah, keep paying attention, stay informed. We can't, and young trans folks can't afford for us to check out of these conversations. And that's just the reality. Like I said, it's life or death for them, and they need us. Because as hard as it is for us to have these conversations, we're supportive. Imagine being someone who's never had any kind of conversation or exposure to the trans community. We've got to be the ones working for them. We have to be the ones making ourselves uncomfortable and having these conversations. Otherwise, we're part of the problem. I don't want to say that I don't mean for things to get this heavy, because I do, because it is heavy and it's important. I know that's not what a lot of you come to Twitch for. So we are going to switch gears and go play some games now. One, know that doesn't mean that we're ignoring or forgetting this conversation. We just spent an hour and a half talking about this stuff. It's all wildly important. And it's important that we draw strength from the community that we have, while also fighting and advocating for them too. Not the rally. Girl, at a rally, I would probably cost a whole lot. My well, you all know, my like filler word tends to be fucking, I don't know, fucking whatever. They take that microphone out of my hand real fast. Mistake made, snatch. Razor. I think it's hard because, you know, there's this kind of duality and in this line that we walk in, like social justice work and advocacy work, where we want people to care enough that they tune in on their own. And in an ideal world, we wouldn't have to educate as much as we do, and we wouldn't have to convince people to care as much as we do. And there are a lot of folks who refuse to do that. There's a lot of, and rightfully so, No marginalized person should have to be doing the work of educating people with privilege, especially in a day and age when the the information is there. There are plenty of people voluntarily educating and providing the education for us. And the reality is, if we want change, and we need change, because again, we're talking about people's lives. Every minute that we don't do something, people are dying. And I think a lot of us are so far removed from that that we don't feel it, we don't see it. But people are dying. We're losing trans kids. We are losing queer kids. We are losing marginalized folks of all kinds every minute that we're not actively pushing back against the systems that are killing them. And because of that, there's this need for someone to be doing that work, that education. And it's hard because most of us don't get paid to do that work. Most of us don't get paid enough to do that work. But if we don't do that work, more people die. And it takes that much longer before we see any sort of justice. And it's hard to find that kind of middle ground of how can I stay engaged in these conversations, keep educating, while still making time to take care of ourselves. There's a lot of guilt that comes with stepping back to take care of ourselves. I do this kind of work professionally, and so it feels like I'm in conversations like this all the time. I spent the majority of last week talking to trans employees, and hearing them talk about how scared they are. Or, we have employees in Ukraine or with family in Ukraine. I spent a lot of my time hearing them talk about how hard it is to see us not do anything or do anything that they feel is enough. And I still struggle with feeling like guilty for like taking time to play video games or anything that isn't actively pushing the needle or working to push that needle feels like not enough. And so I think it's a constant struggle for a lot of us to find that happy medium of making sure we're doing the work, but also making sure we're keeping ourselves healthy to do the work. And there's no one place where that balance lies for everybody. It's different for every person. And I would encourage us, especially those of us who might be cis, white, et cetera, privileged, to challenge where that place is. Because I think sometimes we hide behind that as our excuse when really the reality is we're just not comfortable challenging our own privilege. It's easy for us to say, I need to self-care. I need to step back and take care of myself. This is too much. When really what we're feeling is I'm uncomfortable with challenging and confronting the privilege that I have, and I'm going to use this as an excuse to back out from this conversation. So I would encourage us to challenge ourselves to have the conversations that we think we might not be ready for or that we think we might not be able to have. I would challenge you to push yourself to try. And look to your local community too. I guarantee, in fact, if you need to be connected with someone, Razor, I know someone in your state, I don't know how close they are to you, who does this work specifically with trans folks. They work for a trans nonprofit. They can help you find ways to make that impact locally and feel a little bit less like that scale is so huge. It's a massive issue. These issues have had generations to gain steam, and it's going to take a colossal effort from many people to reverse those systems, to dismantle them, and create justice for marginalized folks of any kind. In this case, we're talking about trans folks. And you can see the impact of your individual efforts on the micro scale if you look for it. So if you ever feel like you're not, that the gravity or the scale of the issue is preventing you from feeling like there's hope, find where it's happening in your neck of the woods, because it is. Well, I feel better. I don't know about you. That was uplifting, right? Girl, you can tell I had some shit to get off my chest today. Damn. Like I said, this shit, it's been weighing on me all week. So thank you all for listening. And again, we're all here. We've got folks here who do this work regularly. We have folks here who can help guide your efforts. If you've got the time, if you've got the energy, if you've got the money, we can help you figure out how to best make it work for trans folks. Absolutely. Yeah, challenge others. I encourage you to do that here too. If I use, and I'll be 100% honest, I am super guilty of this when it comes to ableist language in particular. I hear a lot of folks who still use words like crazy, who still use language that is ableist, who use words like crippled, um, and etc. There's all kinds of language. And I'm very guilty of not challenging that in the moment mostly because I'm not sure of their level of commitment to challenging that language themselves. But that shouldn't matter. That shouldn't matter. So that's something I want to get better at. And I know that a lot of us are still like very new to that conversation of removing ableist language from our vocabulary and not really realizing how much of our language is rooted in ableism. I'm super guilty of not challenging that because, again, I don't know what other people know about it. And I don't want to be in that place of discomfort of having to be like, hey, that's actually an ableist term. I don't know that you really want to keep using that word. And then I have to like face the possibility that that person does know it's an ableist word and doesn't care. But that's part of what being an ally or aspiring to be an ally is about, is making ourselves uncomfortable, having those hard conversations so that the people who are impacted by that language directly don't have to do that work themselves. So yeah, it's hard, and it's a constant thing. There is no goal line, there is no finish line for this work. It will always be something we have to be checking. As long as these systems of oppression exist, there will be impacts on our language that we have to be constantly thinking of. That's a big part of this work, is understanding intent versus impact, niceness versus kindness. It doesn't matter what your intention was. It doesn't matter if I didn't mean anything by it. It matters how it landed, and it matters what effect it had on the people impacted by it. Yeah, I think that's the case for a lot of folks, Razor, is we don't think about it until someone tells us, until someone brings it up. And like I said, it's hard and scary and intimidating and uncomfortable for us to bring that up to other folks, so we don't do it. And that's how these words have been allowed to kind of become so ingrained in the language that we use. So this is me committing to trying to be better about calling it out when I hear it. Please call me out on it too. If I do it, when I do it, it will happen. I will tell you that usually when I do it, I catch it myself, even if I don't necessarily say anything. I should be saying something and correcting myself. I don't always. I do notice it though. But yes, please catch me. Please call me on it. And I will do my best to do the same for all of you. Because that's the only way any of us are going to get any better. And I think learning to see that call out, or some folks use the phrase call in instead because it feels less confrontational or othering. That is an act of love. That is an act of caring and respect. I care enough about the language that you use that I'm going to tell you how to do it better. I care enough about the language you use and the harm that you cause that I want you to do better. It's not an attack on your character. It's not an attack on who you are as a person. It's me caring enough about the things you do, the things you say, and the impact you have that I'm willing to say something. And I think if we're able to kind of wrap our minds around it that way, instead of seeing it as, oh, I got in trouble, which for a lot of us, it's a very, very cultural thing for us that, we don't want to get called out for what we're doing. That cancel culture fucking phenomenon. That's a good thing. I want you to call me out because that means that you care enough about what I say and do that you want me to do better. If you don't say anything, then you don't care if I'm hurting people, and that's not okay. And that's what I mean when I say, it's a constant action that we have to be constantly thinking of this stuff, because it's when we stop actively thinking about it that we revert to those kind of ingrained socialized patterns of ableism, racism, heterophobia, no, fuck the straights, homophobia. um, oh, ow. Anyway, fuck the straights. Anyway, when we're not actively thinking about the language that we use or the impact of our words and actions, that's when we revert to the things we were socialized to believe, which are often prejudiced, biased, oppressive beliefs about other people. I stand by the fuck the straights thing though. That's still true. Straight people are not an oppressed minority, so I'm less concerned about the impact of of my words there. They're doing fine. And the reality is we know that more are likely coming. We will probably see similar bills. We're already seeing similar bills proposed in other states targeting trans and queer youth. There will be no shortage of opportunities to talk about this stuff, and I'm sure there will be no shortage of opportunities for us to do something about these things as well. And that's the important piece. We can talk about it all day long, but we got to be doing something too. Straight, yeah, the one straight person who's probably watching me. Jared's in the next room over, gooped, gagged, plucked, and gagged, and gooly gagged, and all that. Anyway, on that note, we are going to go ahead and transition over to some Fortnite. We're going to play a little Fortnite. But again, we will keep having these conversations. Please know that switching to a game and playing games is not meant to distract or check out from those conversations. I also want to make sure, this is actually a good opportunity to remind us, we have our community Ko-fi. Oh, I have a command for that. It is... Is it that? It is. So, this is something we started doing last month. I haven't been doing a great job of promoting it. I also haven't been streaming that much, so we haven't had a lot of opportunities to talk about it, but I do have a Ko-fi. I'm not using it for personal donations. Are you leaving? Oh. Did you hear what I said earlier? Did you hear the part where I said fuck the straights? Oh, well, have a good day. Have fun at work.